Welcome to Bible study. This is the study we're preparing for Sunday, March 17th, 2024. And we are studying the book of Acts, and we're in chapters 17 and 18 today. Have your text handy. You may want to grab that and pick it up and follow along with what we're talking about today. Today, we are really talking about Paul's intersection with Greco-Roman culture. Now, Greco-Roman culture has always been there in the stories of the New Testament. It's sort of in the background all the time. In fact, here I am, I'm standing in front of our Lenten paraments, and they feature prominently a cross. And the reason they feature a cross on there is because that was the Roman way that they executed the criminals who were convicted of a capital offense but were not Roman citizens. It was typically the way they killed a slave, or they killed someone who had committed sedition or another crime punishable with crucifixion. So the Greco-Roman piece is woven deeply into our New Testament. But today it really comes to the surface in these readings from chapters 17 and 18 of the book of Acts. We have seen the authorities of the Greek world acting against Paul on a couple of occasions. But in all of those occasions, they have been stirred up by a mob incited by either people who had a self-interested opposition to Paul based upon a lack of income, in the case of the girl who had a demon driven out of her, who was being trafficked by her owners, or in the case of the Jewish residents of a community. They rose up against Paul and tried to bring along the local Roman authorities with him. And on several instances, they managed to do so. Philippi, they were beaten and imprisoned for a night, and in other places, they were asked to leave by the authorities. But for the most part, the actors in this have been the people who have been religiously motivated against Paul of Tarsus and his message. Today, we get a very different picture of that Roman world. First, we're going to see Paul interact with the intelligentsia of that world. We're going to see Paul holding his own in and among the philosophers and the people of the Areopagus. And then we're going to see a very important story where again we see the Jewish opposition to Paul and his message, people with an axe to grind, again trying to use Roman authority to move against Paul. But this time it doesn't work. Not only does it not work, it's going to fail spectacularly. And Luke really wants you to see that, in fact, when a judge of substance, a judge of knowledge of Roman law, heard Paul's case, he threw it out of court. You have a precedent now that when people have done this to Paul, Roman law has said it was invalid. Let's look a little more closely at both of these events. The first one is at the end of chapter 17. Paul has come to Athens after his time in Philippi and in Thessalonica and in Berea. He had sort of been chased out of Berea by the Jewish synagogue community of Thessalonica. They had followed him there, and the believers had sent him down to Athens for his own safety, maybe just to cool things off. Paul seems to have been a polarizing figure. He left Silas and Timothy there. They did not seem to attract the same ire of the Jewish community as Paul did. Might say something about Paul. When he gets down to Athens, he is, it says, vexed by or distressed by all of the idolatry that he sees around him. For a Jewish person, there was a handful of tenets they held and that they were willing to die for. And one of them really was monotheism, that not only do we only worship one God, many people in the ancient world only worshiped or were devoted to one God, but what they said was there is only one God and all the others are fakes. And idolatry, particularly the making of these images, these idols built of wood and stone, that really bothered a good and pious Jew. And here he is in the city of Athens, and it is filled with them. They're everywhere. Athens was an ancient city, and over the years, many people had built a shrine or a temple, and there were idols and temples all over that city. In fact, the most famous thing in Athens today is the Parthenon, and it is an old temple to Athena. And there's a temple right below it called the Nike, the Temple of Victory. All of them would have had an idol in them. And it says Paul was vexed by that. He goes to the marketplace where you would have gone to find news and ideas at the time, and he stands up and he starts proclaiming Christ. This draws the attention of some interesting people. In Athens, you would have encountered the intellectual elite of the Roman Empire. The Stoics, the Epicureans are noted here, but there may have been other philosophers and philosophical schools who took notice. They invite Paul to come to the Areopagus, which is kind of the academic center of the Athenian world and hence also the Roman world. If you were a wealthy Roman, you sent your children to college in Athens, and they would have listened to people speak in the Areopagus. Just a few years earlier than this, a wealthy family in Rome had sent their young son to Athens. He unfortunately was captured by pirates on the way, and they ransomed him. They sat him down in their camp and said, write a letter to your family, tell them that you have been captured by pirates and that if you send 200,000 sesterces, we will set him free. The young man turned around and looked at them and said, only 200,000? I'm worth way more than that. And they said, be quiet, kid. Do what we tell you. And he did. They sent the money. He got out, promptly went to Athens, raised a fleet, and pursued and captured and eliminated all the pirates who had captured him. And ended up spending the rest of his life just hating piracy. Passed that along to his son, or his adoptive son, a fellow by the name of Augustus, for it was young Julius Caesar who was captured by pirates. And part of the reason that's important for us is that by the time we come to the Apostle Paul's day, Julius Caesar and his adoptive son Augustus had pursued a rigorous policy of suppression of piracy throughout the Mediterranean, which enabled Paul to go on all of these trips. He was on his way to Athens to go to college when he was captured by pirates. Paul ends up in Athens addressing the same people that Julius Caesar, as a young man, would have gone to learn from. So Paul, standing in the midst of that Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. It's very interesting that he doesn't start off by saying all of your idols are wrong. He doesn't start off by saying, you foolish people, why do you worship these stones and these sticks? They have no life in them. He takes what he can out of it, and that is to say, well, with all of these idols, you must be very religious. Let me talk to you about the true religion. And he's going to speak of the God who made all things, who rules all things. And at this point, these people are very much on board with this. They believe in this too. Especially the Stoics that are mentioned earlier. But when he gets to the end, and I find this very interesting, this is the piece where they balk. He says in verse 30, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world. Everybody was in agreement with that. They all thought their world was, we read this in the Roman commentators and the philosophers and the historians of the day, they all believed the world was descending into chaos and a wickedness, that their forefathers and the people who had lived before them just didn't think it was so bad. It's gotten much worse, was the way people thought about it. He has fixed a day when he will judge the world. They were all terrified of that judgment. You can read the book of the letter to the Thessalonians and hear Paul try and talk them away from that precipice of terror where they were as he spoke to them. By a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance by all, by raising him from the dead. It was his encounter with that Jesus of Nazareth on the road to Damascus that he cites here. I saw him raised from the dead. Now, when they heard of the resurrection, it says, some ridiculed him, they mocked him. But others said, we would hear more from you. So Paul went out from their midst. Some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, so a member of the Areopagus Association of scholars. One guy joined him and believed. And a woman named Damaris. Again, the women, notice how Luke mentions them. And others, he says. This Dionysius the Areopagite has had a fascinating history. We don't know anything about him other than this one mention in the time. But about 500 years later, a fellow started writing Christian literature, Christian philosophical literature, and adopted the pen name of Dionysius the Areopagite. But as sometimes happens when people adopt a pen name, the real author gets forgotten and only the pen name gets remembered. And several hundred years later, many people in the western part of Christianity and throughout the East began to believe that these writings had actually been written by Dionysius the Areopagite and hence had a particular authority. They were from a Greek philosopher who had listened to Paul preach. And therefore they were read with great reverence, and they were deemed to have an almost biblical authority. They had enormous impact on the formation of doctrine and theology in the medieval period of Christianity. Dionysius, you may be interested to know, is the fellow who coined the word hierarchy. So the idea of a church hierarchy, he talked about a celestial hierarchy of angels and all of that, those ideas, and many of them come from Dionysius the Areopagite. He's not that interesting to read. You probably won't enjoy it, but you could go read him. It says after he did this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, sometimes called Prisca too. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. Because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. A couple of things here. Priscilla and Aquila, these two fellow Jews, tent makers, are going to become very important in the story. You'll want to listen for them as they show up. It's very interesting that almost always in the narrative, Luke refers to them as Priscilla and Aquila. That's noteworthy because in the ancient world you almost always put the man's name first and then his wife. But here we get the wife's name first consistently and then her husband. It really appears that she was the one who was maybe the better theologian, the better expositor of the faith, because later on they're going to run into a fellow by the name of Apollos. We're going to get him in the next chapter. And when he's got some rather strange ideas about Jesus, Paul hands him off to Priscilla to be corrected, to be helped. This is very interesting for us because many people think that this Apollos, who shows up here at the end of chapter 18, was in fact the author of the letter to the Hebrews. But other people, interestingly enough, have noted that the letter to the Hebrews doesn't claim any author. It's unique in the New Testament. It has no authorial tradition associated with it. And a lot of people have said they wonder whether it wasn't actually Priscilla who wrote it. And that's why there's no author assigned to it, because in the ancient world it was very patriarchal, and the idea of reading a book written by a woman would have been difficult for some, and so she kept it anonymous. It's a fascinating idea there. They had been kicked out of Rome, and this is really helpful to us for historical reasons, because we know that Claudius did kick all the Jews out of Rome. You can read about this in a Roman historian's text. And what he says, it's in Tacitus, and what he says is that Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome because they were having a dispute among themselves about some fellow named Chrestus. Now, a lot of people have said Chrestus sounds an awful lot like Christus. Did he, in fact, simply mispronounce the name? And was this, in fact, a dispute in the Jewish community over over the role and the person of Jesus? Many people have thought so. But in any event, this pushes Priscilla and Aquila into Corinth, where they run into the Apostle Paul. Paul is there preaching. He's doing his tent making. That seems to be his profession. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word. He was testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there, and he went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Now, his house was next door to the synagogue. My goodness, Paul. I mean, it's understandable. You've had these issues with the Jewish synagogues in the past, and you've had one here, and so they say, we're done with you, go away, and so you go away to start your own Christian church with the Gentiles, and you go right next door? That had to really gall that Jewish synagogue. And it gets even worse because Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, so the congregational president, the guy who was in charge of the place, that very next Sabbath day doesn't turn into the Jewish synagogue, but goes one house next door to the place where Paul is preaching. He apparently said, well, if you're forcing me to choose between listening to Paul and listening to you guys, I'm going to go with Paul, because I believe in this Jesus whom he preaches. That must have stung hard for those people who had rejected what Paul was saying. He went with his entire household. Many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Jesus shows up to Paul one night in a vision. Don't be afraid. Whenever Jesus shows up in a vision and says, don't be afraid, it's probably a pretty good reason to be afraid. But go on speaking, do not be silent. Somebody is going to try and silence you. I am with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. And he stayed there 1 year and 6 months. 18 months he stayed in Corinth, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, And this again is another really significant historical point for us, because for many, many years, we had no record of a Gallio who was proconsul in Achaia. But then in 1912, while doing some archaeological work up in northern Greece at Delphi, which is where there was a shrine to Apollo, they turned over a stone, and what do you know? They found writing on the back side of it. This was a dedicatory stone that listed out all of the gifts that had been made to the oracle at Delphi in a certain year. And prominently right there in the middle of it was Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And we know that the year in which he did that was 51-52. They did their years crossed over a little bit, but it was 51-52 AD. And that's also important because we have since found record of Gallio in other places, and we know that he was only very briefly the proconsul of Achaia. And what this allows us to do is to say, well, we know that the Apostle Paul was in Achaia at this time. And using the book of Acts and his letters as a guide, we are able to actually backdate and front date all of the times of kind of get a good chronology of Paul's life this way. All because we know when Gallio was there. And so we know that, for instance, Paul's vision probably happened around the year 33 to 35. So that's really pretty quick after the resurrection of Jesus, that his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And we also can, by that, surmise when he was in certain places. We know when he would be that he was in Corinth here in 51-52. We know that in 53 he's going back and writing the letter to the Romans, for instance. But Gallio serves another really important function for us. And that is, of course, that as a judge, and we know that he was a very high placed individual in Roman society, that he would have had excellent training. He was a trained lawyer, that as such, when he dismisses the case of Paul, which he's going to do in just a moment, that's going to have legal weight. And Luke is including this story for that reason as well. When Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They were saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Now, Paul was about to defend himself. He was about to open his mouth and to offer up his defense to this charge, but Gallio cuts him off. He says, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. If you brought to me a real complaint, I would listen to it. But since this is a matter of a question about words and names and your own law, see to this yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. This is not Roman law. That's a huge precedent if you imagine that the book of Acts was being written as part of Paul's legal defense. But now there's another reason why this incident is quite important, and that is because we've since learned who Gallio was. Gallio had a brother-in-law. He was married into an important family, and that family included his brother-in-law, a fellow by the name of Seneca. Now, you may have heard that name before. There's a city in New York named Seneca, but it's named after this guy. Or maybe apple juice. I think there's a Seneca apple juice out there. Seneca, the philosopher of the first century that we're talking about, was very famous. He was a Stoic, but he was also the advisor to the new young emperor, a young man who had risen to the throne upon the death of his father Claudius, and he was only 14 years old. And they had appointed two advisors for him, one military and one moral. and the moral philosopher who was his advisor was Seneca. The young emperor's name was Nero, by the way. We're going to learn more about him later. So what you have now is that the advisor to the emperor, his brother-in-law, let Paul go. All of a sudden, the weight of that precedent just got bigger. This is now going all the way up to the very top of the Roman legal system, to the emperor himself. Gallio drives them out of this tribunal, kicks them out. I mean, he would have had his soldiers sort of tip their spears on the side and just push them right out the door. Go away. The members of the synagogue seize the new synagogue leader, the new chairman of the congregation, who had probably been elected on the sole principle or the sole platform or campaign promise, if you will, of I'm going to do something about Paul. This was probably his plan that they're enacting, to charge him in front of the tribunal. And they turn on him in anger and shame, and they beat him up in front of the tribunal. And Gallio watches this and he goes, these guys are crazy. And he doesn't do anything. Sounds like that's the end of it, but it's not. If you have your Bible handy, we turn to the first words of Paul's letter to the Corinthian congregation. This was written some years later. Paul is on his third missionary journey by this point, and he has received word that things are going pretty rough in Corinth, and they're fighting with each other. The first verse reads, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes. Same Sosthenes? Why, it just seems like it almost has to be. Was it the case that as Sosthenes lay on the pavement of Corinth, all bloodied and dirty and dusty and bruised, that it would be the Apostle Paul who stuck his hand out to him and said, come on, Sosthenes, let's get you home and get you cleaned up? Did Paul turn this enemy into a friend, into even a brother, with whom he would pen a letter to this very congregation in Corinth? Remember, they're fighting with each other. Was Paul putting his arm around his old enemy saying, you know, if you're a Christian, you don't really have an enemy? It's an interesting thought. If you have any questions about all of this interaction that Paul has with the Roman world today, let me know. Shoot me an email. Let's talk about it. We'd love to hear from you. God bless you.